I was telling my wife a day or so ago, seems to be an unusual year to me. We're having rain in the middle of July, and not just a little, but a lot. I'm not complaining. Well, yeah, I passed a hayfield coming in this morning, and it's been cut, but there it is. I think the sun will come out, and it's bound to dry out sometime pretty soon. Yeah. August still comes, though. At any rate, we're going to be in chapters 10 and hopefully into chapter 11 of Daniel this morning. Been in Daniel quite a bit of time, and I want to try to wrap it up if possible this morning, but I don't know that I'll be able to. And I've skipped part of Daniel. I'm not talking about chapter 9. It is a prayer that Daniel makes to God, asking for, confessing the sins of the Israelites and asking for forgiveness. But it has no direct bearing on events that happened in the time between the Testaments. Chapter 10, however, and especially chapter 11, do. And according to some people, maybe part of chapter 12. When we get to the end of chapter 11, we'll talk about that. To the best of my understanding, and I've looked at several commentaries, and sometimes the more commentaries you look at, the more confused you get, because they have different ideas about different things. And Daniel is a book with prophecies, some of which there could be no doubt. But others, many people who have education in ancient history more than I disagree on. But we'll mention some things about that maybe later on today. But in chapter 10, Daniel sees another vision. He is on the banks of the Tigris River, and it mentions the first verse, chapter 10, in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel. And this comes in the form of a vision. The Cyrus is mentioned here is the first Cyrus. There will be a second Cyrus, his son, and this one's referred to by name later on in chapter 10. Many believe another king of Persia named Cyrus is mentioned, though his name is not mentioned. But Daniel sees this vision of a man dressed in linen by the Tigris, and the men that were with Daniel didn't see the vision. And this vision frightened Daniel. And don't go down to verse 8. It reads, Daniel writes, "So I was left alone and saw this great vision, yet no strength was left in me, from a natural color turned to a deathly pallor, and I retained no strength. But I heard the sound of his words, and as soon as I heard the sound of his words, I fell into a deep sleep on my face to the ground." Well, Daniel sees this vision, and he really sees what he sees as a man, or someone that appears to be a man, and it frightens him. And there in verse 9 it says, when he heard the man's words, he fell asleep. But he will continue his vision. And note in verse 10, "Then behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. And he said to me," so this man who has this thing that has the appearance of man, we'll explain that in just a minute, or it'll be explained to us maybe. "And he said to me, O Daniel, man of high esteem," and let me stop here. Daniel was a man of high esteem. When he had come to Babylon, at the first he was a young man, but he was chosen amongst the special, or the best and the brightest of the Jews, to serve Nebuchadnezzar. This is many years later. He had served Nebuchadnezzar faithfully, And then when Babylon fell, the Persians took Babylon. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. And they took charge. And Cyrus was the king of Persia. And Daniel ended up serving him. And he served him very well. Daniel, as I've mentioned before, is almost a unique character in that he was able to serve the political powers that were in effect during his life and always served God. And he even changed the political powers. He served the Babylonians well, and then he served the Persian government well and was rewarded by both. He gained enemies in both because he was so popular with the king. But nonetheless, get back to where I was. Verse 11, Daniel, he said to me, "O Daniel, man of high esteem, understand the words I'm about to tell you and stand upright, for I've now been sent to you." And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. Then he said to me, "Do not be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart on understanding this, on humbling yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to your words." But the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days. And then behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left there with the kings of Persia. This man says that the king of Persia has been against him, and Michael came to help him. And most believe that Michael is an angel that was sent to help this man against the kings of Persia. Now, these kings of Persia, I mentioned Cyrus the First. Cyrus the First was a pretty good man. He believed in the rights of human beings, if you will. There is a great archaeological find that was made. It was a cylinder with cuneiform written on it, and it was written by Cyrus. It's called the Cyrus cylinder. And part of that details how he treated the Jews, how he treated them well, and how he allowed them to go back to Jerusalem and start rebuilding the walls in the temple. Some of his subsequent leaders, after he died, weren't quite so friendly toward the Jews. And it's supposed that Daniel's vision here, when he's being told like this, that these Persian kings are some of those. And indeed, there would be problems with some Persian kings after Daniel, or at least in his very, very late life, probably after his death. But at any rate, in verse 14, Daniel's going to be told of some things that are going to happen. "Now I've come to give you an understanding of what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the visions pertains to days yet future." Now some things are going to happen to the Jews while they're under the Persians, but there's some things that are going to happen later, in later days, that will also happen. And some of Daniel's visions will seem, particularly in chapter 11, will seem to reflect what some of those things are going to be. And they will be things that will happen in that 400 years between the Testaments. And they will involve not just Persian kings, but they will involve Grecian kings also. We'll get to that in time. Verse 15, "When he had spoken to me according to these words, I turned my face toward the ground and became speechless. And behold, one who resembled a human being was touching my lips. I opened my mouth and spoke and said to him who was standing before me, O my Lord, as a result of the vision, anguish has come upon me, for I have retained no strength. For how can such a servant of my Lord talk with such as my Lord? As for me, there remains just now no strength in me, nor has any breath been left in me." Daniel is still afraid. He doesn't know exactly what he's been told, and he doesn't have full understanding, and he hasn't been told everything, but he knows that he's getting a message from God, and it frightens him. Skip down to verse 20 now. Then he said, this is the man talking to Daniel, do you understand why I came to you? But I shall now return to fight against the prince of Persia. So I am going forth, and behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. There can be little doubt, if you study the secular history of the Persian Empire, who this prince of Greece is that's going to come. That's going to be Alexander the Great. But I want to mention something happened to the Jews before that Grecian prince will come. Problems with the Jews. It took place during the era of the Persian kings, one that's called Xerxes in secular history, and in the Bible he's called Ahasuerus. And if you've read the Old Testament book of Esther, you understand what that problem was. Now, Ahasuerus, I said, was a Persian king, and he had most of the Persian kings kind of adopted the philosophy of Cyrus, and that they would let the people keep their religion. But now and again, things popped up that threatened that. And during the reign of Ahasuerus, that happened. And go back to Esther and read the story. He had a big party, for lack of a better term. And he wanted to show his wife off before all the men at the party. And his wife, Queen Vashti, refused to come and dance before those men. So he banned her, and he wanted a new queen. And in essence, he edicted that they have a beauty contest to decide who would be the new queen. And Esther was chosen. And he didn't realize that she was Jewish. But then Esther became the queen, and then a man named Haman. Well, first Esther had a kinsman named Mordecai, who was a good servant of the king, and a man that worked for the king of Persia named Haman got jealous because Mordecai received more honor from the king than he did. And that's when he devised his scheme to have the Jews executed, all of them. His desire was to annihilate the Jews that were there under the Persian king's rule. Of course, that didn't work out like Haman thought. Remember, he built those gallows that were, 70 feet tall, I think? And he ended up being hung on the gallows himself. But the Jews came very, very close to being annihilated. And if it were not for the courage of Esther, they would have been. And if you recall in the story, Mordecai told Esther, who knows if you haven't come to this position for such a time as this. It was a unique time. The Jews were under great threat. And yet Esther went before the king. Now, the rule was if you went into the presence of the king without being summoned, he could have you executed. And Esther knew this, but she went in anyway, and he decided to listen to her. And they ended up having a feast with Haman there. And Haman didn't know that Esther was a Jew either. And it all turned out when everything was revealed, like I say, Haman ended up being hung on the gallows he had built to hang Mordecai on. So even under the Persian kings who were beneficial and kind to some extent, there would be problems with the Jews, for the Jews. And it's very likely that some of these Persian kings are exactly the ones that this man who's talking to Daniel is referring to. But at any rate, we read down in verse 20, a prince of Greece is about to come. Now this would be a few years later, but that prince of Greece did come. And it was Alexander the Great. And we'll mention much more about him in coming weeks. Well, let's go on down to chapter 11 now. And in the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. This is Daniel. He's now serving yet another Persian king. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia, and a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. And as soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will rouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. This is Xerxes II. There will be some more Persian kings, and then this one will arise. And he will be more powerful, and he will decide to invade Greece. And he raises a great army and rouses the whole Persian Empire against Greece. And they will invade Greece and try to take it. Let's continue on verse 3. A mighty king will rise, he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded. For his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others beside him. Now, in these few verses, we go from a mighty Persian king to another mighty king that will rise. And it says he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. And as soon as he has risen, the kingdom will be broken up. This apparently refers again back to Alexander. In secular history, Xerxes invades Greece. He has an army of what secular history indicates to us was about 1 million men. And they took their families with them on these war campaigns. So 1 million, probably 2 million people are going across the Persian Empire, and they're going to invade Greece. And that means they're going across present-day Turkey and across the straits there and going to go into Greece. And they have a great navy supporting them also. This is from secular history for the most part. And I mentioned, I think, the battle at Thermopylae, where a very few Greek soldiers from Sparta, 300, held the line against 1 million Persian soldiers, even against the best of Xerxes, his personal bodyguard, which are the best and the finest of his soldiers. But that narrow strip of land between the mountain and the sea was so narrow that 300 men were able to hold it for a few days. And it gave the Greeks time for the rest of their army to retreat and remain intact. And then by the time Xerxes' army finally killed the Spartans, and they paid a very, very high price. And secular history is not certain as to how many, but you can read estimates of anywhere from 10 to 20,000 Persian soldiers died at the hands of the Spartans. But by the time they did that, the Greeks had time to regroup, and also the Greeks had time to figure out how to stop the Persian navy. Now, the Persian navy didn't have battleships. It was to supply the Persian army with food, and they needed a lot of food. 1 million soldiers plus their entourage needed a lot of food and support. And the delay that was caused at Thermopylae gave the Greeks time to formulate a plan, raise a navy of their own. They already had a navy raised, I guess, gather it at the right place, a place called Salamis, and they would actually kind of ambush the Persian navy there and defeat it in a great naval battle. Well, when this happened, the supply chain of food and war materials slowed down dramatically for the Persians. And then about the same time, there was an uprising against the Persians way back over in Babylon. And Xerxes had to abandon his invasion of Greece and go back, take his army back, all the way back to Babylon to put down a revolt there. So the Greeks, those 300 Spartans that died, served a great purpose, even though it cost them their lives. And this prince that's mentioned here, in verses 3 and 4, will be who will arise after the Persians abandon their invasion of Greece. That'll be Alexander. And once again, I know I've mentioned it at least once. Alexander was from Macedon, present-day Macedonia. His father was Philip of Macedon. The Greeks were ruled by city. They had city-states. And Philip had started to unite them, but after his death, Alexander took over, and he successfully united all the Greek city-states and joined them together and raised a great army. And in these two verses, it doesn't even talk about all the things Alexander did, but he did conquer the Mediterranean world, the Middle East. He conquered northern Africa, and he went as far into India. And he did all that in 12 years, or pardon me, 13 years. But then when he had conquered that, it said that he went back to Babylon to make that the capital of his empire. And it said that he wept because he had no one else to conquer. Every enemy he had found, he had defeated. But he died there at the age of 33. He had a son, but that son had been killed. So he had no heir. And that's when the Grecian Empire ended up being split between 4 of his generals. And that's what's mentioned in verse 4. His kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded. There was a period of time when the Greek Empire, after Alexander died, these generals kind of bickered with each other. And finally they came to an agreement and took lands to the north, south, east, and west. And particularly though one of the kings was Ptolemy, one was Seleucid. Those 2 kings and their subsequent kings would have a great influence on the Jews during the time between the Testaments. Of course, by the time Alexander comes, the 400 years has well begun. And so I say this is just a brief prediction of what's going to happen. And now Daniel continues on in chapter 11. I'll mention where are they in my notes? I was going to mention the king's names. Seleucus, he had Syria and Babylon. And from his subsequent kings, they came to be known as the Seleucidae. And they're famous in secular history. Another of those generals that became a king, Lysimachus, and he had Asia Minor. The third one was Ptolemy, that's Ptolemy, and he had Egypt. And the fourth one was Cassander, who had Greece and the neighboring countries. Now, Lysimachus and Cassander had little influence on the Jews. Seleucus and Ptolemy had a tremendous influence on the Jews. Seleucus got Syria and Babylon, that part of the Greek Empire. Ptolemy got Egypt and Africa. And right smack dab in between those two is Palestine, Jerusalem. And these 2 kings and their subsequent kings will time and again, in fighting each other, conquer Jerusalem. And then the other one will attack and come back through, and Jerusalem will be conquered by the other side. And this happened many times. I found one commentary said that throughout history, Jerusalem had been conquered 27 times. And many of these times were by these Grecian kings and their subsequent kings. But they did have a great influence on the Jews and the history of the Jews. I'm going to mention some names. If you study ancient history, you may recognize some of these. Now, all of the kings of the southern kingdom, which Ptolemy was the first, kept his name as a title. kind of like Pharaoh. Pharaoh was the king of Egypt, was always Pharaoh, but it was Pharaoh this, Pharaoh that, Pharaoh that. Well, the Ptolemaic kings adopted the same thing. In 323 BC, Ptolemy Soter became king. 306, he took the title of the king of Egypt. Then in 284, which is roughly 20 years later, Ptolemy Philadelphus became the king. He is of special significance to the Jews. During his reign, the Septuagint was translated. The Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Old Testament. It remains to this day and is still used by Greek scholars. The Greek Orthodox Church still uses it as their main Bible to this day. It's called the Septuagint. Septim means seven in Greek. Ptolemy Philadelphus commissioned 70, actually it's probably 72 Jewish scholars to come from Jerusalem and come down to Alexandria in Egypt to translate. And there were 6 from each tribe, and they translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And I'll mention again, they were eager to do so because part of Alexander's grand scheme was to Hellenize or make every part of his empire Greek. The word Hellenize comes from secular history also. You ever heard of the woman named Helen of Troy? The Trojans went to Greece, kidnapped Helen, who was the queen, took her back to Troy, and then the Greeks went back to Troy and ultimately destroyed it. Well, you recall the story of the Trojan horse? Anyway, to get Helen back. And the term Hellenistic or Hellenizing actually comes from the name of that woman who was kidnapped by the Trojans and then, and depends on how you look at it, rescued by the Greeks. But thus the term Hellenistic Jews came into being because these Jews living under the Greek rule were becoming more and more like Greeks. They spoke Greek. They adopted Greek philosophies. And even those Jews who were faithful to the law of Moses saw their children learning Greek and speaking Greek and not being able to read the Hebrew Bible. They couldn't read the Torah, which is the Pentateuch, the law of Moses. Their children couldn't read it, so they were more than happy to translate the Old Testament into Greek so that their children would be able to read the law for themselves and retain their Jewish culture and history and religion. But this took place under the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus that the translation took place. As a side note, there are many quotations in the New Testament of Old Testament passages. Most of them are direct quotes from the Septuagint. Jesus quoted it several times. Thus, in the first century, the Septuagint was being used by the Jews as their Old Testament, as their Bible. And the apostles and Jesus and many Jews were familiar with it and quoted it. And that's what they learned. And Greek was the common language of the day. It had been so since the days of Alexander. Going on down through history, 246 BC, another Ptolemaic king named Euergetes came to power. 221, about 25 years later, Ptolemy Philopator. And then 204 BC, Ptolemy Epiphanes, and we'll talk more about Epiphanes. There's more than one Epiphanes. This one, the Ptolemy Epiphanes, was the king of the southern kingdom. And in 180 BC, Ptolemy Philometor became the last of the Ptolemaic kings. By that time, the Romans were coming in, and they would eventually take over. On the other side of the part of the Grecian Empire were the Seleucidid kings. And I'm going to mention their names, and I'm going to stop at one of them. I'll mention that in 323 BC, the same time the first Ptolemaic king took power, Seleucus Nicator became the governor of Babylon. 280 BC, Antiochus Soter. Now, Antiochus was another name that's repeated throughout secular history. And cities were named after different Antiochus kings. We read about in the New Testament, Antioch of Pisidia and Antioch of Syria. Those were two of those Antiochs. But in 280 BC, Antiochus Soter came to power. 261 BC, Antiochus Theus. 247, this king reverted back to calling himself after Seleucus. Seleucus Callinicus became king. 226 BC, Seleucus Carinus. In 225 BC, Antiochus the Great. 187 BC, Seleucus Philopator. And in 175 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, there was a Ptolemy Epiphanes in the southern kingdom. This is 25 years later. This man has the name Epiphanes, and it's Antiochus Epiphanes. He will call himself Antiochus the Illustrious. He had a high opinion of himself. The Jews, for reasons we'll mention in a little while here maybe, had a much lower opinion of him. They changed his name Epiphanes to Epimanes, which meant the mad. They called him, so he was Antiochus the Illustrious to himself, but to the Jews he was Antiochus the mad. And he was mad, insane. He was also very mad at the Jews. And we'll get into more detail of that later. Let's look at Daniel 11:6 real quick. Long verse here, a lot of history in this one verse. And after some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south, that's the Ptolemaic kings, will come to the king of the north, that's the Seleucids, to carry out a peaceful arrangement, but she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in those times. Now, this is when it starts to get pretty confusing, to me anyway. The Ptolemaic king, Ptolemy Philadelphus, the same one that sanctioned the Septuagint, he was married to Antiochus Theos. He had a daughter named Bernice, or Berenice. I'm not sure of the pronunciation. And she was married to Antiochus Theos, one of the kings of Syria. And they had been fighting a war for several years, and they agreed to terminate this war by the marriage of one of them's Ptolemaic daughter to the Syrian king, if you will. And part of the agreement was, though, that the wife he had at that time, named Laodice, had to be put away along with her children. So he did so. He, in fact, divorced his wife, married the Ptolemaic daughter, and thus a peace treaty of sorts came to be. For a short time, everything was well. But Laodicea did not like that she had been put down, put away, if you will. And Antiochus became suspicious of his current wife and the Ptolemaic king, so he brought back Laodicea and her children. And but then when she came back, he sent Berenice away. But Laodicea was afraid that he would call her back. So she caused him to be poisoned, and Berenice to be murdered. And she set up her son upon the throne. And this seems to be what's referred to in Daniel chapter 11, some of the, I'll call them shenanigans that happened between the kings. They tried peace treaties, and some worked out for a while, but some didn't. This was one that was arranged by marriage. And then the king said, well, I'm not sure now. Sent her away, calls his other wife back, first wife back. And she's afraid that he'll call his second wife back. So she poisons him and then has her murdered and sets up her son as king. You get the feeling that these people regarded marriage kind of lightly, if you will, and used it to serve their own purposes many times. In verse 7, let me look at verse 7, chapter 11. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place. He will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. Well, this was probably Ptolemy Euergetes, who was Berenice's brother. Get it right here. And upon her death, he wanted to avenge her death, so he took a great army against the king of the north, Seleucus Clinicus, the son that had been set up. And he ended up conquering a good bit of that kingdom, and he even went as far as India, which that king or that kingdom had inherited from Alexander. And then he came back to Egypt with a great booty from the northern kingdom, which he had been able to conquer. Look at verse 8 now. And also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, he will take into captivity to Egypt. And he did. He took all those great goods from the northern kingdom back to Egypt. And they would be on his part, and he on his part will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. So there was peace for a while after this invasion to take care of or revenge his sister. Well, so there was peace for a while. Let's look at verse 9. Then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but he returned to his own land. And this refers to, again, Seleucus Clinicus, the son who was put in power. Verse 9, I just read it. The latter will engage the king of the south, but will return to his own land. This is supposed to be another one of those, that same Ptolemy Euergetes. In verse 10, I've got tons of notes on these, try to keep in mind straight, and it's still confusing me. In verse 10, we read, and his sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, and that he may wage war up to the very fortress. Well, this is probably the sons of this Clinicus, who was put in power by his mother. And they will, in secular history tells us, they did assemble a multitude of forces to try to take back would have been taken by the Ptolemaic kings. But he didn't have money to pay all his soldiers, especially his generals. Secular history tells us he was poisoned by two of his own generals because he didn't get paid. His brother Antiochus was then proclaimed king, so that only one of the sons did certainly come to overflow and pass through. He took Seleucia, regained Syria. He then returned. He overcame a general of the southern kingdom named Nicholas, and he was ready to invade Egypt and came to the very frontiers of Egypt to invade it, but did not do so. I'm rapidly running out of time. I'm not going into all the details. The next two verses, verses 11 and 12, talk about, again, kings that rise up and fight against each other. Verse 11, the king of the south will be enraged, go forth and fight with the king of the north. The latter will raise a great multitude, and that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. But when the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up. He will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. For the king of the north will raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years, he will press on with a great army and much equipment. I say this back and forth continued for several years between these two kingdoms that were remnants of the Greek Empire, and they will fight back and forth. Jerusalem often exchanging hands while they're fighting and taking it and trying to overrun. So the army from down in Egypt would come up into Syria, and the Syrian army would come back down to Egypt, and Jerusalem gets overrun every time. I'm going to stop right in there. One of these kings, as I mentioned his name a little while ago, Antiochus Epiphanes, a Seleucid king. He, in particular, did not like the Jews. I'll jump a little bit ahead here. In one of his campaigns against the southern king, the Ptolemies, he went down into Egypt to invade. And they had many battles, and word got back to Jerusalem that he had been killed. Well, he had already done great evil to the Jews, and when the Jews heard that he had been killed, they celebrated in the streets, literally. Well, when word got back to him that the Jews in Jerusalem were celebrating his death, he called off his invasion of Egypt and headed back up to Jerusalem. It angered him quite a bit. When he got back to Jerusalem, and we'll read some more, we'll talk more about this next week. You've heard the words, the reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. That's mild in comparison to what he did. He would totally desecrate the temple. We will talk about something called the abomination of desolation. What he did to the temple was an abomination. He didn't destroy the temple. He just totally caused it to be an abomination. He set up a statue of Zeus, the Greek king of the gods, to be worshipped. He offered a sacrifice to Zeus in the temple of a sow, a female pig. Well, he knew this would cut to the heart of the Jews. And also when he came back, he executed a number of Jews. Secular history says that he executed 40,000 Jews when he returned because they had been celebrating his death. He was indeed a wicked, wicked man. And his rule of the Jews, and here you're going to get into different interpretations of different commentators, but to the best of my understanding, his rule of the Jews and what he did to the tried to do the Jewish religion and did the temple was what is going to be referred to, and we'll read further in this next week, by Daniel's dreams, the abomination of desolation. This would also, I know I'm going over time a little, portend what's going to happen many, many years later when what I believe is a second abomination of desolation will occur. And that will be when the temple is totally destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. When Jesus spoke of the abomination of desolation, it's very likely the Jews knew exactly what he was talking about, what had happened to the temple back in the old days. But he was telling them it's coming in the future. And when the Romans came in AD 70, it did come in the future. Now that's in the first century, beyond that 400-year period we're studying, but it started back during that 400-year period when Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus Epimanes, if you want to use the Jewish title, Antiochus the Mad, desecrated the temple, did everything he could to abolish Jewish religion, and indeed an evil man. We'll take up there, and I will do my best to get through with Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 12, we're not going to go into because it gets into times that aren't in 400 years. I'll mention some of it briefly, but it appears to talk about the end of all days. And we'll talk about it some next week. So thank you for your attention, and we'll now be dismissed.